Okay, so Lauren, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, no, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm psyched. I'm ready to go.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to connecting with you. I mean, for those that don't know, I've known Lauren since she was about 11 years old, coming to the spring hockey tryouts back in the day for Southwestern Ontario. So I've been fortunate to kind of see you work your way through the ranks here. You've played at the highest levels, and now you're kind of breaking into the door of coaching. But I saw you as a perfect opportunity to have a conversation with someone who is still an athlete, right? You're still part of the PWHPA program, but freshly removed from your university playing days, new to the transition of coaching. And really what I want to do is have a conversation about the athlete experience. I think when you look at what it takes to be a great coach and the life of a coach, sometimes we have to look at the things that a coach impacts, not just the coach's experience themselves, but obviously something like the athlete and what the athlete goes through. Shining light on that will help make the coach's experience more successful as well. So I think, why don't we start just with the question around, when you reflect on your playing experience, what is it about the coaches you've had, the good or the bad, that has stuck with you?
So I was pretty lucky to have a really wide range of experience with coaches. Like, I had everything from dads who had never played before, but had like plenty of kids who played, to, getting my first female coaches in yourself. And when I was in juniors at a pretty young age. So I got that like female coach exposure, which was awesome. And then I was lucky enough in juniors to be coached by somebody who actually had played at the collegiate level and got that kind of experience. But it's funny that that's the first thing that I list off, because that was the thing that mattered the least. I think the thing that always stuck with me was my coaches who were invested in my personal life and who like cared about what I was doing away from the rink and showed enough to ask about it. Because as a coach now, I know how impactful all of that stuff is on your ability to perform, and how much you can get either pushed forward by your personal experiences or held back by them. And having a coach acknowledge that piece of me, or that huge part of me as an athlete, always meant the world to me. And one of my coaches who did it probably the best was Dave Leffler, which first coach I ever had playing girls hockey. Don't think he played much hockey ever in his life. But always asked like, hey, how you doing? How's your brother doing? How are your parents? Like, he worked with my dad, so we knew that. And Mark Johnson was also really skillful at it, in terms of just saying like, hey, how are classes going? And checking in on that side of you. And I think that's always one of the things that stuck with me on the positive side.
Yeah. And what's the difference that makes for you?
Well, it just makes you feel, well, especially for me anyways, it helps you feel seen as more than just the product that you put out on the ice. And, like, similarly, that I was exposed to all these different coaches at a young age, I also was exposed to the idea that your performance could be the most important part about you on a team at a very young age, because I started playing juniors I made a team when I was 13.
Yeah.
So like, I don't know. It just, when you get so surrounded by that idea of there is a grander team goal here that is going to help every individual achieve their own goals, and your piece of that matters, can either be a really empowering thing or it can be a really intimidating thing. And for me, it turned out to be super intimidating. And so like whenever I had the opportunity to not stare that straight in the face and say like, wow, my worth is defined by how well I play, it helped kind of turn my perspective away from that and actually allow me to play the game as I wanted to.
Yeah, that's a great point. We talk about that a lot too with coaches, is that players are smart, right? And they will pick up on what it is you value as a coach.
Yeah.
Right. So we all have a reward system, whether we realize it or not. It's either conscious or subconscious, but the way we interact and engage with our players is our players are going to pick up on that, and they're going to feel the weight of that, or they're going to behave accordingly. If they see that as a coach, you know, you're giving all of your attention and favoritism to the players that are scoring goals or whatever, they're going to feel like my value is dictated by how much I score or how much I contribute offensively. Right. And I think that's the difference. It's something so small, but even having a coach ask how your day was, or, you know, applaud you for doing well on a test or something like that opens the door for finding self-worth in a system that doesn't always put that first, you know?
Yeah. And I think I'm sure it's a hard balance for coaches at the higher levels, not to apply that extra attention to the kids that are like, quote unquote, getting the results, putting the puck in the net or keeping the puck out of the net. Because at least my interpretation of it was like, you want to pump those kids up because that level of confidence can be fragile.
Yeah.
But taking the time to talk to everybody and even talk to those kids too about something other than hockey is so important.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever get the sense, you know, because you've had a chance to work with a variety of coaches, did you ever get a sense that, you know, a certain coach you were working with definitely liked other players more than you, or maybe liked you more than other players on the team? Like, how did that impact you from the player's perspective?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yes. Yeah. I don't want to like name any names, but
of course.
But yes, absolutely. And when it goes the opposite way of what you want, I played scared. I was always terrified of making mistakes because I was already in this imbalance, right? Where like I'm below somebody else. So I have to do whatever I can to at least like get to level playing field with them. So I noticed I was really cautious. I stuck more with the things that like I absolutely knew that I was good at because other people told me that I was good at them, or maybe that coach told me that's what I was on the team to do. And I completely shut down exploration of other skills because my mindset went to, this is like your survival piece, so let's latch on to it. Whereas on the other end of it, when you have a coach who you feel like really values your development, maybe not favors you over other people, but makes you feel like that relied upon player, I was way more adventurous in my training. I was more like willing to take risks in games and was actually able to see myself fully develop. And that was in my first year playing professionally, which was super fun for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, oh my gosh, it dictates so much. And I know that it's a lot to take on in terms of responsibility for coaches, but the more you know, the better you can access the talents of your players, I think. And I do think that that's a point of focus, or should be a point of focus.
Yeah, like putting the work in to find some sort of common ground with all of your players, right? To find something that you can connect on other than just the sport, right? Necessarily. Because I think it's human nature. Like we're all subjective, right? Our opinions are subjective. And I think naturally we're inclined to be more connected or drawn to people that are more like us or that we have more in common with. So sometimes even as a coach, there might be a kid on your team that reminds you of a younger version of yourself. You don't even realize, but in turn, like you favor that kid, or you maybe talk to them a little bit more, or maybe their personality lends them to being more approachable. And if as a coach, you're already like kind of awkward, sometimes you're drawn to talk to those kids more because it's easier, right? So there's a lot of work to do behind the scenes. And like you said, it doesn't have to be that you're best friends with all of the players, but that you're consciously making an effort for them all to understand that, you know, they matter and their contributions matter and that their development matters to you, not just their performance.
Yeah. Absolutely. And the one thing that I am like kind of picking out that you said too is we do have a natural tendency to link up with people who are similar to us. And we see this in like job applications. When it gets to the interview process, people actually choose other people who they identify with,
Mhm.
whether that's through like common experience or even appearance. And to think that that doesn't happen in coaching is crazy, because I mean it's natural.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And it's to accept it's not something that you're doing maliciously, but even just to understand that you're doing it and the impact that it can have on those other kids if, you don't consciously make an effort to try to balance it out a little bit, right?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Crazy. Okay. So I want to stick on the topic of playing, your experience. So there's certain topics that come up a lot in my conversations with coaches, things like work-life balance, self-doubt, finding time for self-care, external pressure to perform. What I'd love to do, maybe we take those four and we look at it from the athlete's perspective. So both from your own personal lived experience, like let's say through, you could even start in junior or minor hockey and through your college years at Wisconsin. But we can talk about your experience as a player and maybe as someone who now works with other players, maybe you have some extra insight from the player's perspective now. But to kind of look at those topics and think about what the challenges are for the athletes. Because again, I think all four of those are challenges that athletes are also facing. I think it's helpful to try to find some common ground between the challenges that the coaches and the athletes are kind of facing at the same time. So why don't we start with the idea of work-life balance? So I guess for athletes, it might be more like school, sport, life balance, but what was that experience like for you?
Well, I would focus on like the going into when it got really like elite level for me, which was in high school. And you figure out there's somewhere you can go with it. And you also figure out that you don't have enough time to do other things. I would categorize like my experience with sport as my job, right? So from the time that I was in high school until I was done with my master's degree, basically, I would say that work was hockey. And then to a certain extent, school was also my work because I took it really seriously and I wanted to do well. But then life was like all of the social stuff and your ability to go and hang out with friends or go to a party or whatever it may be. And I struggled with that balance a lot. And I struggled with the fact that I knew that I valued what was going on with hockey, but I also knew that I was missing all the other stuff. So I knew that it was important and that I should be missing that other stuff, but then you still have that feeling of exclusion from your friend group, maybe. And in that sense, in college, that piece actually got easier because all of your friends on your team are doing the same thing. But learning how to balance hockey and balance school and life was a little bit of a three-ring circus for me. Just because, I mean, there's no hiding it. Wisconsin's known as a party school, right? So a lot of people have a good time, and you're trying to find the balance between how do I get the full college experience and how do I still show up and play. And I was a player who really had to earn my spot, and I struggled with that quite a bit. But again, part of it came from a talk that we had at the beginning of the season, my freshman year, where our coach came in and basically said, look, we want you to have fun. We want you to understand that, yes, we have goals, but you also have to take care of yourself. And at the time, he mentioned that in terms of like going to go get sport rehab stuff done, see the trainers and all that kind of stuff. But as I matured, I started to understand that also meant other things, like not going in for an extra ice session every single morning before class, Not doing that extra workout because you feel like you have to. It was learning how to be selective with what I was doing so that I could manage the life piece.
Mm-hmm.
It's like still valuing and understanding that just because you're choosing to not do something doesn't mean you value this any less, but it means that you're actually starting to value the life side of it more.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it takes experience, right? Like you kind of got to go through it and figure out what doesn't work before you can figure out what really, really does work.
Yeah, for sure. And what would you say? Again, this is all in hindsight, right? Based on some
Mm-hmm.
of the athletes you're working with now and understanding the challenge of work-life balance. What would you say a coach can do to help a player in terms of establishing a healthy balance between work and life? I think we've talked in the past about how, athletes will learn more from what you do than what you say. So if you yourself are always at the rink, or if you're not making time for your family or creating breaks on the holidays, then it's not really creating an environment where athletes can value or learn to value that. Again, they're gonna learn to value what you tell them is important, either directly or indirectly, right?
Yeah. Um, well, I think you've had Kim on, and I think I want to say she said something at peak. Uh, um, when I was there for a short time. Um, I want to say she started out with like a speech in the gym or maybe on the ice at some point, and I don't know why I'm remembering it, but I remember her talking about being good human beings, right? And how hockey is important, but it's never more important than your well-being or your life, and it's a sort of conduit for working on those other things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think it's always important for coaches to show you that they also care about those things. So, like getting to see Kim actually like bring her kids to the rink and, make sure that she's stepping out to take care of them in between periods because like you don't need to be with your players the entire time.
Yeah.
I think is important. And in that sense, leading by example can be a great way to show your players like, hey, this other stuff matters and it's important. But I do think just having open conversations about it is super nice and helpful, because especially for female athletes where, we still can't make a living playing this game.
Mm-hmm.
So it really is not the most important thing in your life. It may
Yeah.
be an important thing, but there's so much more to life after hockey. And having a conversation about that, I think, is important just for setting the bar at, hey, this thing is important and you love it and all that, but there is a lot more to consider.
Mm-hmm. And when you reflect on your college experience, if there
Mm-hmm.
was one thing that you wish you made more of a priority over those 4 or 5 years, what would it be?
Mm. I This is a tough question because I think it took time for me to realize how to do it. But by my junior and senior year, I had really figured it out. Like, I knew when I needed to take a break. I knew when I needed to, like, go out and have, fast food with friends because you just, like, really feel like you need the comfort or whatever. Um, I maybe wish I would have prioritized my mental well being earlier. Like, this, I worked with Susan in high school
Mm-hmm.
and started the mindset stuff and worked through a lot of things in high school and then kind of felt like I was cooked and ready to go. And then I got to college and there were a whole new set of problems that I didn't think I needed to revisit this mental skills stuff for. And it took me about a year and a half of like serious unhappiness to figure out, well, maybe I need to start this up again. So I wish I would have done that. I wish I would have prioritized my mental health earlier because I really do think it was a huge factor in why I underperformed on my own standards so much.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the interesting thing, right? With mental performance, it's like that term mental fitness, and
Yeah.
it can be equated to physical fitness, like you can go to a gym for a year, but then if you just stop and you're like, well, I'm fit now,
Yeah.
and then you just expect to go through the rest of your life, never walk into a gym again and you're good,
Yeah.
and we talk about it too with coaches often when it comes to that mental performance piece. At least we've gotten to the point where coaches will bring in like a mental performance coach to speak with the team in preseason once or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's just once. And that's not the point. It's like you have to train your brain like a muscle, like you
Yeah.
train your quads or like you train anything for strength. It needs to be consistent and regimented to stay in shape, or
Mm-hmm.
else it will lose its
It just
endurance.
relapses, right?
Yeah.
Like I got jacked in the mental gym in high
Yeah.
school. And then
Yeah.
I stopped doing it and I was so out of shape mentally, and it took that's the other thing too, right? Is when you continue doing what you're doing, but you stop the prehab or like the mental skills work. I had put myself into a hole of really uncomfortable knots that I had redeveloped, some bad habits that I got back into. So
Mm-hmm.
not only was it like trying to get back in shape when I got back into doing the mental skills stuff, it also turned to a whole lot of damage control
Yeah.
that I had to do that piece before I could even start bettering myself because I had dug myself into a hole of my own making. Yeah, it was a tough year for sure, but
Mm-hmm.
getting it under control, and when I got back into mental shape, it showed tremendously.
Yeah.
It's not comfortable.
No. Well, you're right. The first step is so you're in shape. The first step is you get out of shape, and then the next step is those injuries.
Yeah.
And now the recovery or getting back to being in shape is a longer process because you have to work through all of the rehab first. But
Yeah.
that's a good way to put it. And what
Mm-hmm.
would you say? Because this is a very common theme with all the athletes that I've spoken with. And I know that you can speak to this because you work in the field of mental performance coaching now. What do you think coaches can do? Like, what are some tips for what they can do to help support their athletes' mental performance, to help keep them mentally fit over the course of the year?
With I think asking questions about it. So I, as a coach now, like on the ice, I actually find myself asking questions about what the players are thinking, not in a bad "what were you thinking" kind of
Yes.
sense,
Tone
but
makes a
in
difference.
yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
Um, but asking like, okay, so if this is what the drill is, this is what we're trying to do, what's going through your head when you're trying to do this? And one of the examples that comes to mind right now is we were trying to do like a pass off the pads drill. So it's like a 2-on-1, and you shoot the
A
puck from a far
chasse.
pad. Yeah,
Shot pass. Yeah.
yeah, yes. Um,
Chasses.
it's a good nickname. I like that more than
Yeah.
Pop.
Well, yeah.
um, but they're 11-year-olds, right? So they're still working on like accuracy and shot strength and all that kind of stuff. And I pulled this one kid aside and I said, so what is it that you're trying to do in this drill? And he goes, well, I'm trying to hit it off the pad. And he had not been able to do it for the past couple of reps. And I asked him, I said, okay, so if you're trying to hit the pad, what are you thinking when you shoot the puck? And he said, don't miss. He's like, I just don't want to miss the pad. Like, literally, I just want to hit the pad. And I said to him, I go, okay, well, if I tell you not to think about an elephant right now, what do you think about? And he goes, well, an elephant. What does that have to do with this? And I said, okay, if I tell you not to miss the pad, what do you think about? Missing the pad. So what do you think is going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
And I think just having those conversations with athletes about the mental side of it can bring it up from the subconscious awareness for them to say, hey, maybe I should also be paying attention to this.
Mm-hmm.
And, coaches were not asking you to be a mental skills coach, right? Because you don't have time for it. But having those conversations about what's going on mentally can spur that kind of thinking in the athlete and get them to pay attention to it as well. Because again, they pick up on what you value.
For sure.
So if you communicate that you value what's going on mentally, I think that that can also help them learn how to value it as well.
No, absolutely. It's absolutely true. And you're right. I think that's the challenge. This is like a passion project for me because you're right. Coaches don't have the time to be mental skills coaches.
Right.
But I like foresee this world in which the coaches can be given tools, like mental performance tools that they can give to their athletes that can just be a regular part of the season, just like, you know, a warm up and a cool down are. Because I think most teams do those things. And, you know, whether it's like a couple of reflective questions or setting 3 goals for yourself in practice, there are little things that are easy to implement that can make a big difference and that would go along with what you're saying, like having those conversations, you know, making sure that they know that you do value the mental performance side and you're getting them to think about things. But I think sometimes coaches shy away from it because they're like, no, it's like this big complicated thing. Like I'm not a neuroscientist and that's fine. And you don't have to be, but I think there's small steps that we can implement that would make a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of coaches have the like I don't want to mess with that, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not so Freudian.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Exactly. And like you said, it's as simple as just getting athletes to think about what they're thinking, you know,
Yeah.
because so often they're just on autopilot. So
Mhm.
it helps to kind of bring things just to the conscious for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Okay. One of the other topics would be self-care. So again, we talk with coaches a lot about this, that they feel, you know, that it's hard to find the time to invest in themselves because they're invested in their team, worried about how their team's performing. And then outside of that, often maybe they have a family to tend to or whatever, but finding time for themselves can be challenging. I would love to hear about your experience when it comes to that self-care as an athlete. It maybe looks a little bit different because I think the physical fitness part is kind of worked into your regimen, but there's other layers of self-care. Like what was your experience like as a player?
So I think sometimes the physical like workouts, stuff like that can get shrouded as self-care, right? Like, oh, you're taking care of your body, you're preparing your body to play the sport, so it's self-care.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the times it can also feel like work, so it's not so much self-care. Um, I had to learn how to like change my perspective on workouts so that I could allow it to be a piece of self-care. And what I mean by that is like every time I went into the gym, I didn't have to be lifting the heaviest weights. Um, I didn't have to be like maxing out reps every time. I just kind of allowed myself to go to, especially in season, where I felt like I was hitting that limit of, okay, if I do a little bit more weight, like I'm going to be gassed and I'm not going to be happy about that on the ice. And learning how to set boundaries for myself in that sense was a piece of self care. Um, but then also learning how to have fun with it
Mm-hmm.
and not be so competitive all the time was really important. And our strength coach in college, his name's Jim Snyder, was awesome in summer workouts with getting us to do fun stuff.
Mm.
We did some not so fun stuff, like running up stadiums at 7 a.m. But then on Fridays, instead of doing like traditional cardio, we might have played spike ball for 30 minutes.
Nice.
And he would make like circuits that we did that were really, really hard kind of fun because he would bring in something random like swinging a sledgehammer at a tire and like making it kind of like a race and
Yeah.
getting us to be happily competitive away from the rink because like there was no it wasn't like you were going to win something at the end of it. But a piece of self-care that took me a long time to figure out was my limits and knowing when to step away when I needed to, because I used to get these huge feelings of shame and guilt if I had something going on physically or mentally that was keeping me or telling me I shouldn't be maybe like going to work out that day, or unable to practice to the level that I wanted to. And I mean, like, one of those turned into a full-blown labral tear in my hip because I was terrified of telling somebody that some of the movements I was doing were starting to bother me. And because I didn't want to miss workouts. I was scared to say that, like, hey, yeah, my stride looks funny right now because my hip hurts a lot, because I didn't want to get sat. And when I finally learned, like, hey, this is actually hurting your performance more than it's helping to push through it, and I actually went to my trainer and I said, hey, I think I need to get this looked at, it was all like an uphill journey from there, which was great, but it took me like 6 months to say something about it. And it went from being, I don't know if it would have been rehabable without surgery, to needing like a full labral repair, which put me out for 6 or 7 months. Thankfully, I was able to push through for the whole season. But yeah, it's just learning to step away, I think, is one of the hardest things for athletes, because it's go, go, go. And the mentality is, if you're not in your spot, somebody else is going to take it and move up into it, which is how it should work, right? Because you want to be able to fill those gaps. But when you're functioning from a scarcity mindset, like I was for a lot of my college career, that was a really terrifying concept. Because in my head, if I took, a couple weeks off, or if I took a week off of lifts, or, a week off of practices to rest my hip, what happened if I got back in the lineup for practice and I was that 7th D on the bottom of the chart who wasn't going to be dressing for the games? So yeah, like, uncoupling self-care and stepping away from negative performance outcomes was big.
That makes sense. What fueled that fear? Because I think it's very common with athletes. I think it's a good thing to touch on, like the idea around the fitness regimen when you're playing, especially at the university level. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of like fear of external judgment, or fear of negative consequence. What fueled that for you? Was it coaches? Was it things that you saw happen around you? Was it maybe things that your teammates were saying? Like, was it a collective fear was it based on anything in reality, or was it just like a fear that kind of existed and no one wanted to find out whether or not it was, valid?
Well, I think it all started with my own perspective on it. Like, I had my own belief systems about what I needed to do and what it looked like to be successful and to be a hard worker, and to be committed to the team. Like, my viewpoint of that was so skewed, it's not even funny.
Yeah.
Because if you weren't able to do every workout, if you weren't able to, like, be in the top 3 for lifts, that meant that I wasn't doing that.
What informed that?
Well, I have always valued being a really hard worker. And I remember getting a lot of praise even in juniors when we started working out as teams, for being strong. And that sort of played into my role as a hockey player, which was as a defensive defenseman, who, like, you take care of the front of the net, you get the puck out, and you deal a little bit more with the physical side of things. So I think, like, it built up in me through years, and the comments about, like, not being an offensive defenseman, not having the finesse, not having, that side of things, not having quick feet was one of them. I got drilled into me. So I was like, well, you know what? I'll just be the hardest worker. If I don't have, like, the hands, if I don't have the offensive prowess that some of my other teammates do, I will be the hardest worker. So when you're, like, so stuck on that one thing, whenever something threatened that for me, I immediately went to, well, I don't deserve to be here. I'm not good enough. Because I can't be this one thing that I'm supposed to be. And then from that point, like all the little things that people would say, then you take that and internalize it. So, you'd hear coach say like, "Oh, why weren't you at lift today?" Or you'd hear teammates go like, "Hey, where were you this morning?" That kind of stuff then gets internalized as, "Oh, they're judging me because I wasn't there." Not just, they're curious as to why I was missing.
Yeah.
So I truly don't think that in the season it was like we were pressured to do more or to like, not have off days. But depending on where you're coming from, anything can be skewed to make it feel like that. And I was definitely in a mindset where I felt like that.
Yeah. See, it's so interesting to me. Like that just shines a lot of light because you paint that picture, right? It's like from a young age, or I guess in junior, but even from before then, because I remember when you were like 11 or 12, it was like you were always a very hard worker, right? And you were praised for that. And I think it's understanding as a coach from the player's perspective, if you praise the players for something, that is going to drive their behavior. Likewise, if you make comments, intended or unintended, but negative comments about what someone cannot do, they will also equally internalize that as a limiting belief. So as coaches or as parents or as any adult in these kids' lives, like you are really going to play a major role in shaping their belief systems about themselves. And like what you're talking about now when you got to university and some of those beliefs you had about working hard and what that meant, like you put all of your eggs in that basket, not because you necessarily chose to, but it's because that's what you learned about yourself from the people around you. You know what I mean? And it's really powerful stuff for a coach to understand that that's the weight that their words can carry with an athlete. And it also highlights what you touched on earlier, which is opening the door for conversations about that athlete and their strengths and creating opportunities for their development, right? Rather than critiquing their performance. When you critique their performance, you're telling them what they're good and bad at. When you talk about their development, you're opening the door for their potential, which will be better serving, in college or just in life beyond, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, like coming from that perspective of this is that thing that I'm good at, and I know that I'm good at this thing because I've been told that, and like I know that I live it. We used to do these reviews at the beginning and at the end of the season in college, which I think is actually great to sit with a player with all the coaches and say, hey, what are your goals for the season? And then go back and talk about them. But whenever I asked for feedback on how I was doing, I was already subconsciously primed to only hear the negative stuff and to only interpret it as you are deficient in this and it's not going to change. And we're seeing your negative things, right? So instead of taking it as, hey, maybe you're deficient in this right now, but we think you could get a lot better at it, it was always like, yeah, you're just bad at this. And that's what we notice. So I think it's also important to have a conversation about that is, hey, these are things you're asking for them, right? And we're trying to give you an honest opinion on what you could maybe work on a little bit. It's not saying that you're bad at them, that you can't do them, or that you don't do them a little bit already.
Yeah.
It's that if we're going to put you in a direction to work in, why not put a little focus here?
Yeah.
Because, yeah, like going into those things, hearing, like decision making needs to be faster. I was like, yeah, great, thanks. I'm so terrified of making a mistake. I already know that.
Yeah.
Your foot speed needs to like improve. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm 5'9" and I'm 175 pounds. I'm trying.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was like, again, it was more on me because I was coming from that mindset where instead of viewing it as an opportunity to grow, I viewed it as a personal attack because it meant that I wasn't working hard enough to improve it.
This is so good because this is such a common challenge, right? And this is why a lot of coaches dread giving feedback, or they feel like I tell them and they just don't listen, or, you know, I don't know how to approach it because the players get so defensive. Like this is such a common theme that comes up. So like when you reflect back, right, and you were in that spot, and I know you're not far removed from it, but what do you think is something that the coach could say or do to improve that? And maybe it's not in that meeting exactly, right? Maybe it's stuff over the course of the season, or maybe it is in that meeting, but like, what do you think the coach could have said or done to make you less defensive in those moments, to help you kind of reframe your mindset? Because I mean, coaches might say, well, that's not my job. But if we really want to get through to our athletes, we have to understand, especially with female athletes, for whatever reason, there are a lot of limiting beliefs, right? There are challenges when it comes to confidence or doubt in their abilities. So what could we do? What could we do as coaches?
Again, and I know I'm probably starting to sound like a broken record, have those conversations about it and talk about like developmental focus. Right. And I wrote about this in a post that I put on my Instagram recently. And one of the things that I wish I would have told my younger self, like freshman year of college, was that your coaches don't expect you to be like cooked and ready to go. It's a process. And I wish that they would have instilled that in me, because I wasn't able to do it for myself yet. So like talking about the development and talking about, hey, this is a big jump. We acknowledge that. And there's going to be bumps in the road, but it's all about improving yourself, not so that you get more playing time, not so that, you know, you're that number 1 or number 2 D or number 1 forward or the point getter. It's so that you can feel comfortable in the situations we put you in. It's so that you can feel good about what you're able to do on the ice. Not like, oh yeah, hey, maybe if you work on your footwork, you'll play more.
Yeah.
Because without the development aspect, my brain's like, sweet, I will go get a ladder and I'll do so many foot speed drills that I'll be in the rink until 10 p.m. doing them. And yeah, I don't know. I think talking about development and kind of removing the shadow of being afraid to tell young athletes that like, hey, you're probably not where you need to be yet, and that's fine. Like this is a growth thing, so like buckle up and be ready to grow, and not, you know, take the fact that you don't play every game your first season as a preview for what the rest of your college career is going to look like. It's
like the whole progress over perfection thing, right? Like I think a big part of the coach's responsibility is having that patience, right? Because the athlete will feed off of that. If you are patient, you create an environment where they can develop and grow, and you're not demanding or expecting results all the time. And there's another layer to that for coaches, because the challenge is often coaches feel a weight to perform, right? So they feel like they need to get those results, and in turn that impacts how they interact with their athletes. It's like the long game versus the short game. Like any coaches that's around long enough gets to the point where they realize it's about the development and the process. But at the beginning, you're just trying to prove yourself and keep your job, you know, or you're brought in and they're like, you have to win this many games. So it's hard. It's hard to not look at the results yourself. But over time, most coaches do realize that it's not about, like, you get the results by focusing on the process, right? But it's interesting, like what you said about talking about, you know, I think sometimes coaches think of it as strengths and weaknesses versus like strengths and opportunities for growth. But also, like you said, I think most athletes, it's like, I want to work on this so I get more playing time. And it's trying to reframe that conversation. So it's like, I want to work on this so I can be more confident in my own performance whenever I'm on the ice or whenever I get a chance. So making it about the athlete versus the external reward that might come with improving that, because then it just creates more pressure and weight, and then
Right.
they don't
And if
improve.
they start working on it and they don't get that external thing, then it's a total failure.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think the other piece to it is like when you have those meetings and you have those conversations about what to work on, I know it's a lot to remember because, in college you have upwards of 25 athletes on a team, but like taking time to then check in on those things during practice and look for them.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, I mean, I know that any one of my coaches knew that I was trying to work my foot speed. So, like, having one of them come up and say, hey, like, that actually looked really good there. So, what did it feel like when you were doing that?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, how can you replicate that more? What was going on in that situation where you were able to access that? Right?
Yeah.
And kind of affirming when they're doing it well and then continuing to point out where to apply it more,
Mm-hmm.
I think can be helpful. Number one, in checking in on the things that you told them to work on. But again, leading into that feeling seen and feeling heard thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you go to give like super personalized feedback, I mean, at least I would have taken it as like, hey, you remembered our conversation. You're seeing that I'm trying to work on it. And I appreciate that.
Yeah. That's a good point. Like the reinforcement piece, right? So like positively acknowledging your athletes for engaging in the process, right? Like for working on something. Hey, like,
Yeah.
good job working on that, whatever. Because if you just tell them to do it and then they go and do the work, but they don't get any acknowledgement for doing the work, right? Or they don't get anything until they get to that end goal, they may not get there. And then the motivation's out the window.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that's also just like logistically, like maybe that's somewhere where you implement like the assistant coaches, right? Or maybe even the leadership group on the team, depending on your team culture. Like you can have your athletes acknowledging each other, working on their processes, working on strengthening their areas of growth or opportunities for growth, or your assistant coaches. It doesn't all have to fall on you. You can kind of create that culture.
Yeah. Yeah. And my, the coach I'm working with now, we actually have conversations about this stuff, like after practices and say, like, okay, what is it that we want to work on? Like what happened today in practice or in the game that we need to work on? And then, as the D coach, I take a lot of notice on the little things because that's what I've really focused on as a player too.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the next practice, it becomes how can I communicate this to them that, hey, this is what you need to work on. Here's why. And then further communicate when they're doing it well and when they're doing it or trying to do it, but they could be doing X or they should try something else, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's like super important, especially for girls and for what seems like younger boys too, because they eat that information up, right? Like the amount of times I remember saying to myself is like, I just wish somebody would tell me what I am doing right and what I'm not doing right.
Yeah.
Was insane.
Yeah. Well, and the order of that, right? Like I think as a coach, investing more time in pointing out what they're doing right than what they're doing wrong makes a huge difference because it's just a confidence thing, right? If you have a coach say, oh, you did an amazing, and being specific, oh, like that was an amazing pass up to whatever, those things will build their confidence, which will make them more eager to work on those areas they need to grow in. Whereas if they're just constantly being told what they're not good at, they're going to be left being like, what am I good at? Nothing, according to you, right? So there's like, and I know that as on the mindset side too, like that positive psychology approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it makes them more, not only does it make them more eager to work on the things that they need to improve on, but it also like psychologically allows them to be in a place where they can view it as an opportunity for growth as opposed to a personal attack.
Yes.
So it sets them up for success with your feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, like, you should absolutely be invested in finding the positive before the negative.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Mhm.
It's good stuff. Okay. Now that we've kind of talking about you on the coach side, I would like to know, what has that experience been like for you? So you're just getting into it, you're coaching on the ice, you're coaching athletes when it comes to mental performance. What would you say is maybe like one of the greatest challenges you're facing now that you're on the other side of the equation?
Um, no. So I would probably say the the biggest challenge that I have as a coach right now, like an on ice coach, is uh how do I word this? Dealing with and navigating frustration when athletes aren't doing something that, like, you've pointed out to them multiple times. One of the biggest things right now with our team for D is having stick on puck in one-on-ones.
Mm-hmm.
We're like super into the big whooping, like, let me just basically throw my stick at this
Yeah.
person and try
Hope
to
it
knock
works
the puck
out.
away.
Yeah. If not, we're in trouble, but
If not, the guy's going right by me,
yeah.
which is happening a lot.
Yeah.
Um, and like remembering that this is still so much a process for them, and that my frustration is has nothing to do with them and their efforts, but it has everything to do with what I do in this situation. Right? So like, I know that if I were out there, I would do this and this is the right thing to do. And kind of decoupling that from, hey, these kids are 11, they're still learning all of the basics of the game, and at any given moment on a 2-on-1 or a 1-on-1 where you're yelling at them to have stick on puck, they probably have 10 other things in their head that they're worried about.
Mm.
Namely, not getting beat.
Yeah. Which means they're probably going to get beat because they're thinking about not getting beat, right?
Right.
Like the
And
missing net.
then,
Yeah.
yeah, and then all the other stuff that we talk about, like staying in between the dots, making sure that their gap is under control, and all that kind of stuff. So learning to not just say, hey, you need to have stick and puck, and actually going in with, hey, your gap is actually pretty good. Like, your gap looks good, but to help your gap and to make it worth the effort of, getting up ice to get a good gap, you need to establish stick on puck.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to, the reactions that we've all gotten at players. It's just like, you need to do it right now.
I know. Well, and that's the challenge too, right? Like as a coach, I think we all come to it having a lot more playing experience than the kids we're working on often, especially if we're working with younger kids. And I think you do witness a lot of frustration at that level where, exactly like you said, I told them to do this 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 times and they're still not doing it. And you know how you would behave in that situation. But I think it's amazing awareness, even what you said, like to understand it's an 11-year-old. There's a lot going on in their head. Like their attention span is short. And even like taking a skill and, like you said, giving them something small and concrete repetitiously until they get it, like kind of lowering our standards and our expectations and then moving on. So if it's closing the gap, like maybe that's the message you're driving home, close the gap, close the gap, close the gap. And then once they have like a general understanding, or they understand that concept, they grasp it, then you add, stick on puck, and you can kind of build things. But understanding you have to move at their pace, not yours. And like being able to navigate your expectations as a coach and kind of meeting the athletes where they are. Like, what advice would you have for coaches? So maybe you go back in time to like your 11 or 12-year-old self, and you're playing or you're working on a skill. Like, what is it that you needed to hear from a coach, or that if you heard it from a coach would help you, perform at your best?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that focus on the process, right? And I remember responding really, really well to coaches who said, hey, this part is good. You're getting this part, but now you need to start doing this, and here's why. Right? Like allowing the athlete to see and experience the process, right? Not just tell them to do something because you know it's right. I was always one of those why, right? Like, why do I have to do this?
Mm-hmm.
And once I knew the why, I was like, oh, well, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
Now it's easier for me to go out and do it because I know why I'm doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think like focusing on the process is really, really helpful and something that I always valued.
Mm-hmm.
But not just, explaining it, also letting them experience it. If that
For
makes sense.
sure. Well, what is it? It's that saying, like, tell me and I'll forget, teach me and I'll remember, involve me and I'll learn, right?
Yeah.
So having them involved in the process is
Mm-hmm.
very important. Um, Speaking of which, like the involvement or athlete empowerment,
Mm-hmm.
maybe we can kind of wrap up with this idea, but what do you think coaches can do? Like maybe 2 or 3 actionable things from your experience that a coach could say or do
Mm-hmm.
that would help empower an athlete, as in help the athlete kind of learn to think for themselves and lead themselves. Because again, I think that's a common challenge we see with
Mm-hmm.
athletes, and coaches get very frustrated. It's like, well, they don't know how to think for themselves. I ask them a question and they don't even know, but I think a lot of it is the culture around sport is a lot of athletes have never been empowered to think for themselves. They've always been told what to
Right.
do.
Yeah.
Right.
And they have their
So
parents telling them what to do, and then they
there's
get to
always
their pro.
someone
Yeah.
telling them what to do. Right. So
Yeah.
like, what can a coach do to kind of create opportunities for athlete empowerment?
I love answering questions with questions. um, but I think it's especially in hockey, and I know it's the same in other sports. It's as much a mental game as a physical game, right? And you have to learn how hockey works, and you have to like build your IQ and your self-awareness in terms of that. So asking them questions instead of just giving them the direct answer. So if somebody says, "Hey, what should I do in this situation?" give them the opportunity to reflect on it to you and say, "Well, okay, yeah, I can tell you, but like, what do you think you should do?" If you're in a one-on-one and you see that there's no forwards coming back to support, or you notice that you have a forward coming back, what should you do? Should you be more aggressive, or should you just try to keep them to the outside? What do you think? Because I do think like that's the involvement piece.
Mm-hmm.
And then that allows them to start problem solving on their own, and also teaches them that at some point they're going to need to answer these questions on their own.
Yeah.
And then gives them the ability to try it with somebody who's going to help them, even if they get the answer wrong, right?
Yeah.
So it's like trying it in a safe environment, right?
Yeah.
And then kind of helps build their confidence to say like, okay, well, maybe they'll know how to do it in the experience next time.
I love that, because you're right. The point will come where they do have to make that decision on their own, and it's called in a game. Like I think about hockey and the entire game, the athlete is the one on the ice being faced with all of these decisions, and they have to make the decision. And sometimes
Right.
coaches get so frustrated because in a game, the athletes will make all the wrong decisions, because
Right.
in a practice, you're there to dictate to them exactly what to do in these predetermined reps and drills, and they do it and they execute well. But then in a game, well, they just don't get it, because you can't implant yourself, into the athlete's body and make the decision for them. It just highlights how important it is that you do empower them to make those decisions in a practice setting with a safe environment, like you said, so that in a game, they can make those decisions confidently. It's a great point.
Yeah. And I think the side note to that is like, if they do it and then try it in the next rep and it doesn't work, don't like get super angry at them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Because that's one of those things that creates the belief system that, and like this is the one part about coaching that is a great privilege and also a great responsibility is if you tell somebody to go try something and they don't get it right on the first rep, and you tell them, don't ever do that again, or whatever it may be, you're basically implanting the idea that like trying new things is a bad idea.
Yeah.
Because with that comes, you know, getting reprimanded, negative consequences, like everything else. And that's also been a unique challenge moving into the coaching space, because one of the things I brought with me from counseling when I do like this kind of coaching, like mindset coaching, is I really try not to give people answers ever. I want to help them find their own answers, and I don't want to introduce my own bias.
Mm-hmm.
But on the ice, it's a little different, because you do have to do a little bit of that guiding and like, hey, this is right versus this is wrong. Yeah, so like giving them the idea to play with a new concept and try it out in practice
Mm-hmm.
without any supercharged feedback, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Or negative repercussions, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No,
It's an interesting game to play.
it is. It is. Well, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I really appreciate you making the time for this. This has been, I think, really insightful just to look at things from the player's perspective. I think you shine a light on some really valuable feedback for coaches. I think a lot of people will take a lot from it. Yeah, and I appreciate you making the time to connect today.
No, absolutely. I mean, you know this. I love to hop on the phone and chat with you. So we go way back. It's so funny now thinking about that. Like, I was such a little Lauren.
I know you were, and
started.
it's the same Lauren. I would say you're maybe a little more outgoing now than you were before. You were a pretty shy kid, but there's certain elements of your personality and your character that certainly haven't changed.
Mm-hmm. But no, and it was great getting to talk about this stuff. And it's funny because the more I talk about it, the more I wish I had it earlier. Right? Like, I wish I could go back in a time machine and sit with myself at 13 and say, like, look, you can go one of two ways here. You can beat yourself up and expect yourself to be perfect and think that your coaches expect yourself to be perfect as well. Or you can choose to enjoy the process because you don't get that much time doing it.
Mm-hmm.
You can ask questions and not be afraid of the answers. And you can like value yourself in this process as well and have so much more fun.
Yeah.
Because I think somebody saying that to me would have just changed everything. But at the same time, I'm so thankful for the experience that I had, because now it allows me to help girls and other athletes going through the same thing, because it really is a pretty universal story. Like, I'm not the only one who experienced these things. So being able to help the next generation is super rewarding.
Yeah, no question. Well, what is it? It's like perspective is a gift wasted on the elderly or something. It's like you don't realize until you're older, when you have that perspective, and when you're younger, you don't have any idea. But I think that's the goal. Like, the hope of the conversation like this is that coaches can be that voice for those athletes, that they can share that perspective. Mm-hmm. And even coaches that have lived through coaching experiences can share that perspective with coaches that are new to the coaching world as well. It's definitely a team effort, but this has been awesome. Last thing I'd like to do is kind of share your handle, maybe give you a minute to talk about what you do and where people can find you. I mean, I would highly recommend you for anyone who has athletes, elite level, any level, that are looking for mental performance training. Lauren has literally walked what she talks, so she is a great person to turn to. But where can people find you?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Instagram, and I post pretty regularly on there just about mental stuff. So if you ever want to get a little insight into my perspective on things, you can follow me on there. It's just at Lauren Willie with a Y, 17. And I'm trying to get better about being on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Still not there yet. But yeah, so Instagram is great. You can also email me, Lauren at elitehighperformance.com. And I try to get back to people within a day or two. But yeah, even if you have questions about, like, hey, I have a kid who's going into something similar, you just want some advice, I love mentoring. So feel free to reach out if you've just got questions, or if you're interested in some coaching. Yeah, send me a message and we'll get talking about it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Talk to you
Yeah,
soon.
absolutely.